Um, Dean Rickles is a professor of history and philosophy of modern physics at the University of Sydney in Australia, where he directs the Sydney Centre for Time. He has specialized in quantum gravity and has written several books, including A Brief History of String Theory, From Dual Models to M Theory, and Life is Short, an appropriately brief guide to making it more meaningful. He has also co-authored with Harold, the book that Harold mentioned earlier, on dual aspect monism and the deep structure of meaning. He has many other interests, including musicology, economics, public health, AI, and psychology. Dean's talk today will consider parallels in physics to synchronistic events in which a latent meaning appears to be borne out. Friends and colleagues, with you, Dean Rickles.
Thank you. Okay, so I should share my screen now, I suppose. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing, I'm told.
So the host has to enable.
Yeah, okay, and then we go there, keynote share. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
My slides? You got it?
Yes.
Okay. So, Morgan said in the question period, there's something like psyche is an intervention in the natural order of things. So this talk is basically about similar ideas that we find in physics, where there's a kind of participation of the observer, which becomes something greater than a mere observer, in the actual outcomes and phenomena that we find in physics. And it's not necessarily fringe physics, it's kind of pretty orthodox physics given slightly different interpretive, given a slightly different interpretive gloss. So I'm not a Jungian analyst or anything like that. I came to Jung pretty much through his later metaphysical ideas, especially his work with Pauli, of course, and I think the book edited by Beverly was one of the first I looked at on Jung, actually. I've since read, I think, pretty much everything. A lot of it I find very impenetrable. What I'm talking about today has most to do with Mysterium Conjunctionis, which for some reason I find to be less impenetrable, mainly because the ideas I think are so close to a whole bunch of other ideas that crop up in the history of philosophy and also, as we'll see, in surprising areas of physics. So, I mean, I'm coming from a background as a philosopher of science, where I used to teach that Jung was basically the epitome of anti-science. And I've learned the error of my ways now. And I think that Jung's ideas, many of them are as solid, if not more solid, than very many that we find in modern physics. So I'll be talking about this somewhat surprising overlap between what we might think of some of these more far out ideas of Jung's from his metaphysics and some ideas of physics. And the idea is this, that, as I said earlier, Jung attributes these cosmogonical powers to mankind. Okay, so world building powers. We'll see how that looks in a moment. Physics, particularly quantum mechanics and certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, seems to agree with that. And the reasons seem to be broadly similar. They have to do with a participation element that's necessary in order to make sense of the world, in order to make sense of the manifest experience that we have. In both cases, I think the reason why they look so similar is that in both cases, there's a much older set of ideas at work that link to the notion of the absolute, the notion of an absolute, what Harold was referring to as a psychophysically neutral realm. And the notion of creation of something from this absolute, which is sometimes labeled as nothing because of its lack of things in any objective sense. Okay, so it's not objectivized reality. And as I'll mention, you kind of need this notion of a sort of no thing domain, this absolute, in order to make sense of the notion of creation in the first place. And there's kind of a battle, it seems, that's going on in physics, maybe other areas, over whether there is genuine creation or whether everything just is given, and we have no hand in what happens in the universe. So the picture of my title slide here is pretty much I think it's everybody who I mention in this talk at some point. It's a variety of philosophers, physicists, psychoanalysts, who all seem to have this same particular viewpoint on the nature of humans, the nature of consciousness in the universe, and that it plays a greater role than is usually supposed. They've all been labeled slightly mystical. They're all concerned with the subject-object problem. They all have something bordering on the existentialist about them, in that they deny this fundamentality of the subject-object division, saying instead that what's fundamental is something neutral, which they've all tried to sort of elucidate in some way, get a handle on, which is obviously very difficult. We can't elucidate it precisely because in trying to elucidate it, we make it manifest. Right? That's one of the ways we make this thing manifest. So one of my current projects is battling with exactly this notion of what is the nature of this absolute? How does it become manifest? How does it become non-absolute? How does the split happen? And in other words, what is the nature of creation, of genuine, true creation? Okay, so the project I just mentioned is a history of the problem of why there is something rather than nothing, and how that question has been posed through time, whether it can be posed in certain schemes of thought, how the terms something and nothing change, and so on. And I assumed that Leibniz was the originator of the expression, why is there something rather than nothing, in this kind of format. But you can find even in the Rig Veda, the oldest written text, something remarkably similar. So this is from the Hymn of Creation. And it says, who knows the secret, who proclaimed it here, whence this manifold creation sprang? And it gets to the heart of what this talk is about, when it says there was neither non-existence nor existence then, neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond, what stirred where, in whose protection there was neither death nor immortality, no distinguishing sign of night nor of day, that one breathed windless by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. So it's the idea that in this absolute, we can't really speak of it as in any kind of thing-like terms at all. And we have instead a unity of opposites. And obviously what's happening when we get when we're doing science and when we're dealing with an empirical world is that we've somehow there has been brought about a split between a subject and an object. And the idea is the subject is perceiving. The usual idea is that the subject is passively perceiving the object. Obviously, synchronicity plays around with this notion of passivity, the idea that we are just receptacles of information coming in, and we find things like the world becoming mind-like as much as the mind becoming object-like. So, so what we usually find in these older accounts of creation is something like the primeval waters. It's always something like the primeval waters, and we always see that when they're trying to explain what this is, it has to be something like not this or not that. Neti neti is how the Hindus call it. Our probably the most common accounts of creation are obviously the accounts in Genesis. So in the prologue of St. John's Gospel, we have the famous, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which looks like a case of creation from nothing, but it's not necessarily creation from nothing. Okay, there was a huge debate, of course, about the nature of creation in this account, whether it was ex nihilo or not. Eventually, there was the lateral council that decreed that yes, it was going to be creation from not genuinely from nothing, including time was created. Otherwise, you're denying the God's omnipotence and these kinds of ideas. But what we find here is, of course, that we're bringing in the world through the logos. Okay, it seems that there's sort of meaning created in this moment of creation, and it's brought into being through the word, being talking about the crucialness of language in the question period, and here we see it very much in operation. I just need to move this. A more explicit account of creation from nothing is this from the Maccabees. So it writes, I ask you, son, look to the heaven and earth, and seeing all things in them, be aware that God made them from non-being, and the race of men began in this manner. But again, it's not completely clear whether non-being means absolute non-existence or just the non-existence of heaven and earth, the manifest world. And again, there was a lot of debate over this, over whether it was sort of creation from some pre-existing materials, some amorphous matter, or whether it was genuinely a novel creation. So that's one account of creation. Why is this not moving? There we go. A more modern account that fits probably the scientific worldview that we have at the moment rather better is this from Cicero, from his De Divinatione. So he writes that the things which are going to be do not come into existence suddenly, but the passage of time is like the unwinding of a rope, producing nothing new, but unfolding what was there at first. So this looks very much like an early version of the block universe picture, right? Everything that is going to happen is already sort of pre-programmed into the system at the beginning. So William James famously coined this term block universe, and he used it as a term of disparagement because it was describing a world with no loose play, as he called it. It was a machine, as he put it, in which only necessity and impossibility operate. So you can't get creation in a world in which there's only necessity and impossibility. So James viewed the world as a pliable kind of thing, which he called a pluriverse, borrowing this expression from Benjamin Paul Blood. And it's something that comes into being in drips and is a work in progress, essentially. But this block universe view seems to be the standard view, and there's a whole bunch of other viewpoints, negative viewpoints that go along with it. So you can find it expressed particularly clearly in this passage from Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate physicist Steven Weinberg, in his book, The First 3 Minutes. So he says it's almost irresistible for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that we were somehow built in from the beginning. It's hard to realize that all of this, i.e. life on Earth, is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. It's even harder to realize that this present universe has evolved from an unspeakably unfamiliar early condition and faces future existence of endless cold or intolerable heat. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. So this, as I say, is pretty much the popular view today. You see all kinds of evidence for this. I was watching something the other day with Yuval Harari saying how we are hackable machines with no free will and have to forget free will now. Well, I mean, that's not my kind of view. He's welcome to be a hackable machine, but I think I'll go with William James's approach. So we have these two accounts of creation, one in which there's genuine creation and one in which creation is only apparent and it's merely an unfolding of what is already there. As E.O. James puts it in this book, Creation and Cosmology, as the problem of ultimate origins and the idea of creation ex nihilo lie outside the range of the primitive mind, it's usually assumed that all things have come into being out of existing materials, such as the primeval waters of a mysterious abyss. Now, I don't know why he would say that ex nihilo is any more less primitive, or why the primitive mind couldn't come up with those ideas. I've already shown that I think you can find evidence for that. But I also don't think the notion of primeval waters is particularly primitive either. I think what we find in a lot of the physics accounts I'm going to be talking about is something that isn't a million miles from the primeval waters. The primeval waters, remember, are described as this chaotic situation where you don't quite have being, you don't quite have nothingness. You have all of the opposites merged in together in some sense, a unity of opposites and so on. And I think this is pretty much what we find in a lot of modern accounts of quantum mechanics, as I'll explain. Now, what is missing from these mechanistic accounts, Weinberg and so on, is precisely the fact that mankind and consciousness, the subject, seems to be left out, and we're focusing entirely on the objects. There's a nice passage from some, from these primitive creatures, the Aztecs, where they write about a story of the Quetzalcoatl, who writes that, who stated that the gods are anxious that someone should inhabit the earth. And, well, why, you might ask? And I think it's basically a claim about the necessity of, maybe not humans, the necessity of subjectivity and consciousness in the universe. So mankind wasn't created to worship in this sense, but is there to function in a co-creative capacity. And I think Jung writes very much in the same vein as the Quetzalcoatl. In his answer to Job, he has something very similar. So he says that the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. What nature leaves imperfect, the art perfects, say the alchemists. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. And that's going to be the crucial point, right? That the subject is necessary in order to generate objectivity in the world, make it manifest. This act we usually ascribe to the creator alone, without considering that in so doing, we view life as a machine, calculated down to the last detail, which, along with the human psyche, runs on senselessly obeying foreknown and predetermined rules. In such a cheerless clockwork fantasy, there's no drama of man, world, and God. There's no new day leading to new shores, but only the dreariness of calculated processes, a la Weinberg. And he's talking about his old Pueblo friend. He says his friend thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their father, the sun, to cross the sky each day. I'd envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief and had been looking about without hope for a myth of my own. Now I knew what it was and knew it even more, that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that in fact, he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which, unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through the millions of years, it would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being down to its unknown end. In other words, it would be pointless. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being. So I think this is very closely captured in the versions of physics that I'm going to very briefly explain, not in too much technical detail. So a lot of this appears in the book that Harold mentioned that we wrote together, the more technical bit. So we find similar statements to this scattered around amongst philosophers that Jung was, I believe, corresponding with. We find it in Bergson, that the idea that the essential function of the universe is a machine for the making of gods, i.e. these consciousnesses are co-creators. They have a responsibility themselves in the universe for bringing about what happens. William James puts it even more succinctly in a very nice little statement here. He says, the universe equals God and Company Limited, where I assume sort of the partners, the board members or something like that. So there's something existentialist about this. I mentioned the existentialist bits in a moment. First, this other passage of Jung's presents another key aspect, which Harold alluded to, which was the notion of a latent meaning in this kind of account that you don't get in the mechanistic account. So he writes, again, this is in a letter to Erich Neumann, that I can't quite see my slides if it's like this. Since the laws of probability give no ground for assuming that higher syntheses such as the psyche could arise by chance alone, there's nothing for it but to postulate a latent meaning in order to explain not only the synchronistic phenomena, but also the higher syntheses. Meaningfulness always appears to be unconscious at first and can therefore only be discovered post hoc. And so there's always a danger that meaning will be read into things where actually there is nothing of the sort. Synchronistic experiences serve our turn here. They point to latent meaning, which is independent of consciousness. Since a creation without the reflecting consciousness of man has no discernible meaning, the hypothesis of a latent meaning endows man with a cosmogonic significance. Again, this raison d'etre. If, on the other hand, the latent meaning is attributed to the creator as part of a conscious plan of creation, the question arises, why should the creator stage manage this whole phenomenal world, since he already knows what he can reflect himself in? And why should he reflect himself at all, since he's already conscious of himself? Why would he create alongside his omniscience a second inferior consciousness, millions of dreary little mirrors, when he knows in advance just what the image they reflect will look like? So this is, he's referring to the duality that exists between the subject and the object here, I think. The fact that in order to have any kind of image, you need it reflecting back. And clearly he doesn't want it just reflecting back by a dreary mirror, as Jung puts it. You need some sort of active participation. So it's this, the idea that humans or consciousness is participating in the construction of reality is what is broadly existentialist about this. So there's no easy division in this kind of view that's presented here between a cosmos and humans and consciousness. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics also place man in the world as an agent, a participatory agent whose decisions and actions shape the world in just such a participatory manner. So I've called this elsewhere quantum existentialism, which I think is a pretty good sort of way of describing what's going on here. It's usually called participatory realism. The world in these kind of interpretations doesn't have an objective existence independently of our participation. So the physics is mapping on very closely to this, this kind of Jungian idea here. It's the participation that breathes life into it by the operation of these opposites, this subject and object. So on the existentialist, the link to existentialism, this kind of makes the point very clearly from Yalom's book on existential psychotherapy. So he writes that the existentialist position challenges the traditional Cartesian view of a world full of objects and subjects who perceive those objects passively, in other words. The existentialist position cuts below the subject-object cleavage and regards the person not as a subject who can, under the proper circumstances, perceive external reality, but as a consciousness who participates in the construction of reality. So this is, again, very closely related to the Jamesian kind of view. What does it require? Well, again, it requires this notion of creation. And if you've got creation, you need some notion of what it's being created from. So usually in older creation myths, we have, as I mentioned earlier, some notion of primeval waters, or in this case, as you can see in this image, a cosmic egg of sorts. Sometimes the egg itself emerges from the primeval waters. There's a famous Chinese creation myth that describes a primordial egg that contains a primal being, this Pangu. That the egg breaks and Pangu separates chaos into the many opposites. So the egg is the thing that contains all of the opposites, but doesn't have any of them manifested. There's an Egyptian story of the Orphic egg, in which the cosmic egg is hatched from this hermaphroditic deity, Phanes, who in turn creates all of the other things. And again, the deity there is something that's neutral, it's psychophysically neutral. It's the duality emerges from this entity. What would be another one? Another one is in the Upanishad, for example, you have a supreme being in that case, which is something like ultimate reality, Parameshwara, or Brahman, which is again a neuter entity. That's something that you can't define conceptually again, because it would limit it. It's unlimited. And then the creation is a matter of splitting Brahman into its pieces, so that Brahman basically represents possibility, and the plurality comes from splitting, much in the same way as Harold was mentioning with dual aspect monism. This is a sort of early version of something like dual aspect monism. And in that one, the manifest reality is somehow less fundamental than the unmanifest. Another example from Egypt again, which more explicitly mentions this duality, is the myth about Heka, about magic, from the Coughing texts. So on this, it's written that, O noble ones who are before the Lord of the universe, the All, behold, I've come before you. Respect me in accordance with what you know. I am he who the unique Lord made before two things, i.e. duality, had yet come into being. In this land, by sending forth his unique eye when he was alone, by the going forth from his mouth when he put the Logos who upon his mouth. So again, there's something to do with this non-dual state and a process involving the Logos, which generates some kind of splitting into a duality. Very nice expression I found recently in this book about the Apocalypse, the Book of God by Keneally. Again, makes the point of the idea that this state of absolute has to not have any notion of thingness in it. So he writes that the state of being of the infinite and absolute reality, the eternal parent, during this state of the infinite unmanifest, can't be expressed in words, for it's beyond words, can only be thought of symbolically by means of its only possible symbol, infinite space. Even symbolized, it can be thought of only in terms of negation. For being in the state of absolute being, it cannot be thought of as possessing any of the qualities, attributes, or properties of thingness. And then it seems to be that our representations, our systems of thought are what introduces the manifest reality. And finally, another nice example, again, I just found this recently from a book on Rosicrucianism. Strictly speaking, the infinite unmanifest is a nothing rather than a thing, and yet not such a nothing as implies notness or not, but rather such a nothing as implies the possibility of everything, yet without the limitations of thingness. So it seems to be then that there's a necessary precondition for this participatory view that's being presented, which is that you have to have real possibility in order to have creation. For there to be something new under the sun, you have to have a conversion of this possibility into actuality, and that's basically what creation is. To have that, you need to have chance. You have to have something that takes place without a cause, okay, which links us to synchronicity again. So we have something like this. There's a set of possibilities that exist in some sense, but not as things. It's unmanifest, and they get focused by what looks like some sort of participatory element into a single outcome, which is actuality or the manifest. And as I'll mention, there's a physicist, John Wheeler, who has many nice ways of displaying what's going on here, where we're sort of our questions and our experiments and our interactions with the world are responsible for bringing about that very world that we're observing. Okay, so we observe the world and get information, and we're sort of created by that. But the very world that we're observing is already partly our creation. So to use an Eddingtonian metaphor, we're analyzing our own footprints, basically. Okay. And indeed, John Wheeler, the physicist, who is most closely associated with this participatory view of the universe in the context of physics, quotes in his autobiography from William James, approvingly. This sentence in particular, that actualities seem to float in a wider sea of possibilities from out of which they were chosen. And somewhere in determinism says such possibilities exist and form part of the truth. So there's a sort of existence to this absolute, but not in any sort of tangible way. So it's the participators that give tangible reality to these possibilities, selecting one, as it says here, choosing one. And the choice comes about in Wheeler's theory from the questions that we decide to put to nature. And in particular, they have to take a particular form. They have to be yes/no questions, which would give us back a bit of information. So he has this famous view, now famous in physics view, known as it from bit. So we get our manifest entities, our its, our things, our actual things, our objectivity, from the bits of information, from the questions that we put to nature, which somehow is the selection principle for generating this manifest world from the possibilities. Wheeler and David Bohm, who was mentioned earlier, and Arthur Eddington and a whole bunch of others were trying to find some sort of formal model of this process from this potential state, this unmanifest state, to the actual state. So Bohm probably is most famous here, I suppose. So he has this whole theory of the implicate order, which would correspond to what I've been calling the unmanifest, and the explicate order, which is the manifest order. And he tries to develop it's a sort of Hegelian model of how we get from that implicate order, which is formless, to the manifest explicate order. And he has this quite complex theory known as hollow movement, where we've got this sort of process of becoming, and he calls it basically being becoming. It's a process of creation, essentially. And if you want to know more about that, then the book with Harold is the place to go. Wheeler himself dabbled with the idea that it might be a calculus of propositions that sits in this implicate order, this unmanifest state. So it's all of the possibilities of the sort of calculus of propositions. Think of all the propositions and the way you can add them together. And then there's an element of choice that he has to add to that. So he speaks of adding a participator to the calculus of propositions to get physics, basically. And this is where this now, I think, quite iconic, famous image comes from, which is sort of like a modern Ouroboros, basically. It's a case of the observer participator, as he puts it, converting conceivability into actuality. And he even mentions that will is at its heart. It's an act of will to choose which questions to put to nature in order to convert conceivability to actuality. Or as he puts it, no participator, no phenomenon, no question, no world. Which is essentially the same thing as what Jung called, borrowing the term from Lévi-Brühl, participation mystique. So it denotes, as he says, a peculiar kind of psychological connection with objects, and consists in the fact that the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship which amounts to partial identity. This identity results from the a priori oneness of subject and object. Now, this diagram pretty much encapsulates that exactly. We have this eyeball, which is the subject, and it's observing its own past there, but it's creating its own past, not just observing it. So we have this sort of cyclic element. There's always circuits and cycles appearing in this work of Wheeler's. So Wheeler was one of Niels Bohr's proteges. He went and did his research, postdoctoral research with Bohr. And he took on Bohr's particular viewpoint, which is that it's wrong to speak of an objective universe out there. So this is a letter from the Wheeler Archives written to Kurt Gödel. And he says that I was quite startled a few months ago at a little party at Oscar Morgenstern's to learn that you believe in the existence of what is sometimes called an objective universe out there, which he thought was in contravention of the consequences of the quantum principle as presently envisaged, i.e., according to the interpretation of Niels Bohr, one of the chief architects of quantum mechanics. So this is basically the famous debate, the crux of the famous debate between Bohr and Einstein. As Wheeler puts it here, in the last talk Einstein ever gave, I can't read it here because this thing is in the way again. Einstein ever gave some months before he died, I suppose, to his seminar on relativity. He explained how he had come to relativity and what relativity meant to him, but went on to express his discomfort with quantum theory. And he asked, if a person such as a mouse, mice are people too, looks at the universe, does that change the state of the universe? He just could not handle precisely this idea of a participation mystique, of the idea of a role for consciousness in the universe, in creating how it goes. Einstein had a specific view, which was basically that the universe is, there might have been an initial creative act. Once that was underway, the universe is logically and physically complete. It goes its merry way, doesn't care what humans are doing or thinking, and there is one single mathematical model that will explain it and model it all, and you'll be able to represent it all. And in particular, objects have their properties independently of what other objects are doing and what our minds are doing. Bohr, on the other hand, had a very different view, which was again based on this idea of a necessary duality in which we have to take into account the role of the subject in the universe. So he writes here that the epistemological problem, namely in quantum mechanics, under discussion, may be characterized briefly as follows. For describing our mental activity, we require, on the one hand, an objectively given content to be placed in an opposition to the perceiving subject, while on the other hand, as is already implied in such an assertion, no sharp separation between object and subject can be maintained, since the perceiving subject also belongs to our mental content. From the circumstances follows not only the relative meaning of every concept, or rather of every word, the meaning depending upon our arbitrary choice of viewpoint, but we must in general be prepared to accept the fact that a complete elucidation of one and the same object may require diverse points of view which define a unique description. So he didn't think there was a unique description of the universe. There was context mattered in this case. In other words, that's experimental context, i.e. which questions we put to the universe matters on what we're going to get out of it. Most famous example of this is the double slit experiment, where depending on whether you ask the question, are you a particle or are you a wave, you will get different phenomena exemplified or made manifest in the world. Now, I mentioned the existentialist elements of this viewpoint earlier. Bohm makes them very clearly here with respect to Bohr's own position. So he writes that, as for Bohr's being influenced by what was going on in other fields, he admits privately that he was strongly affected by Kierkegaard's existentialism. The point of contact is in the question of the dual nature of subject and object, of action and contemplation. Clearly, Einstein is Mr. Contemplation here. In physics, there arises the analogous problem that the observing apparatus, which is the proxy of the observing subject, is linked to the rest of the universe by indivisible quanta. Indeed, this is only a special case of the universal linkage of each part of the universe to the whole in the same way. Such a linkage means that the essential sides of the very being of each system are in its indivisible quantum relationships with what is not, i.e. what is other to it. This holds as much for the observing subject or for his proxy, the observing apparatus, as it does for any object that we might care to distinguish from its background. As a result, there is an inherent ambiguity in what each partial system is, because what it is in essential respects its relation to its other, i.e. there's an essential duality in all things, where we tend to treat a system as complete when in reality it's partial, and we tend to bracket off its background, for example. In this way, physics has led to the denial of the mechanistic idea of a universe made up of distinct parts or elements, such that each part exists separately and simply comes into interaction with other parts. This idea of ambiguity of the mode of being of its parts is, in my opinion, a very deep one and of fundamental importance for further progress. Okay. Now, David Bohm, of course, famously had discussions with Krishnamurti, who was sort of the theosophical world leader appointed by Charles Leadbeater. Now, the basic principle of theosophical thinking, one of the basic principles, is that ultimately all is one totality, right? All things from one, with a descent from something formless and absolute to matter and form, which is exactly Bohm's view, I might add. And again, we mentioned some of these aspects in the book with Harold. So we have a story of whether the universe is a machine versus whether there's creation, ongoing creation, and in that case, meaning. Again, Jung, if God's consciousness is clearer than man's, then the creation has no meaning, and man no raison d'etre. In that case, God does not, in fact, play dice, as Einstein says, but he's invented a machine, which is far worse. Actually, the story of creation is more like an experiment with dice than anything purposive. So I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, Einstein was describing a machine. He's pretty explicit about the machine he's trying to describe and calls it a logically closed system. He wants a logically closed system. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we get this curiously existentialist viewpoint even in the physics. So Sartre, of course, famously said, the world is the mirror of my freedom. And then we have Jean-Paul Wheeler here with his beret on saying, nature at the quantum level is not a machine that goes its inexorable way. It's wrong to think of the universe as sitting out there. Instead, what we get depends on what question we put to it, what experiment we arrange, what registering device we choose. We are inescapably involved in bringing about that which happens to be happening. Absolutely anathema for Einstein, but not anathema for this older kind of picture that we were discussing earlier. So I like to call this Jontology, which is basically no participator, no world. You don't have any kind of manifest objective world if you don't have a participator asking it questions, making it manifest itself into aspects. And he puts it very clearly, very nicely and very clearly here. So this older view, and the view of Einstein, is that the world exists out there independent of us, and we, the observer, are safely hidden behind a 1 foot thick slab of plate glass, not getting involved, only observing. But we concluded in the meantime that that isn't the way the world works. In fact, we have to smash the glass, reach in, install a measuring device or a subject to install that equipment in place. Doing that prevents the insertion in the same place at the same time of equipment that would measure the momentum. That's Bohr's complementarity coming in. Niels Bohr's complementarity principle coming in. We are inescapably involved in coming to a conclusion about what we think is already there. What we thought was there is not there until we ask a question. No question, no answer. And as he puts it, the vital act is the act of participation. Now he has an image for what's going on here, for this notion of the generation of a phenomenon from something that isn't a phenomenon, from this, what is essentially an ineffable absolute realm. And he calls it the dragon, Bohr's great smoky dragon. And as he says, we have to recognize a new animal in the zoology of nature, beyond particle, beyond field of force, beyond space-time geometry, the elementary quantum phenomenon. The Great Smoky Dragon, Bohr's phenomenon, has its tail sharply localized at the point of entry to the apparatus where we've prepared it. Its teeth are sharply localized where it bites the grain of photographic emulsion. In between, it is utterly cloud-like, localized neither in time nor space, i.e., it's essentially an absolute, which is defined by not being having location in space and time. The search for the message of the quantum is a continuing pilgrimage, marked so far by three great way stations: indeterminism, i.e. real possibility, genuine possibility; complementarity, i.e. asking questions, putting questions to nature that make other questions impossible; and phenomenon, which is the manifest effect that you get. Now, this way of drawing things in terms of a dragon puts us in mind of basically chaos. I mean, in mythology, the dragon is what we use to think about the notion of chaos, where we have this sort of primordial union of opposites. So it's interesting that he would use a dragon to represent this ineffable chaos. So these three great way stations that he mentioned, we can sort of view as a kind of flow chart. Okay, so you have to start from chance or indeterminacy. You have to add will or choice, which is the complementarity, or the participators' questions. And then you get objectivity out. That's your sort of output state, which is the tangible reality. So Wheeler spoke himself of getting definiteness out of indeterminism. And he has a nice, I mentioned he has lots of circuits. He has this thing called the meaning circuit, where again, we are generating ourselves the very things that we end up detecting in the final analysis. Again, analyzing our own footprints. A modern version of this is known as cubism, quantum Bayesianism. Harold's done some work on this. And again, we see the existentialist kind of viewpoint. So this is Chris Fuchs, who's an architect of this view. He writes that our actions matter indelibly for the rest of the universe. But quantum mechanics signals the world's plasticity. With every quantum measurement set by an experimenter's free will, the world is shaped just a little as it participates in a kind of moment of birth. So you need the notion of free will for this to make sense. And for that, you need the notion of chance and real possibility and indeterminism. Which takes us again to the notion of synchronicity, of course. So in this chaos of chance, synchronistic phenomena were probably at work, writes Jung, operating both with and against the known laws of nature to produce in archetypal moments syntheses which appear to us miraculous. Causality and teleology fail us here because synchronistic phenomena manifest themselves as pure chance. The essential thing about these phenomena is that an objective event coincides meaningfully with a psychic process. That is to say, a physical event and an endopsychic one have a common meaning. This presupposes not only an all-pervading latent meaning, which can be recognized by consciousness, but during that pre-conscious time, a psychoid process with which a physical event meaningfully coincides. Here, the meaning cannot be recognized because there is as yet no consciousness. It's pre-consciousness, it's pre any intention, of course, which is what we mean by an objective meaning. There's an objective meaning here. Objective may be the wrong word. There's a real meaning here, or a fundamental meaning. This is from von Franz's book, Number and Time. She writes that a meaning manifests itself in synchronistic phenomena which appear to be independent of consciousness. And the quality of knowledge is what Jung calls absolute knowledge, since it seems to be detached from our consciousness. So we're getting back again to this sort of the central part of this dragon of chaos, of Wheeler's ineffable dragon. I'll skip this because I'm kind of running a little bit late now. So the idea in diagram form is basically this, that we have this absolute, which is a synthesis of opposites. There's, as Jung writes, the multiplicity of the empirical world rests on this unity of opposites, the unus mundus. Not two or more fundamentally different worlds exist side by side. Rather, everything divided and different belongs to one and the same world, but it manifests itself as a duality for us. And what we tend to do is ignore one aspect. We always ignore the subjective aspect, focus on that objective aspect. But there's always a subjective aspect necessarily, and it's connected by synchronicity, essentially, by acts of will. The Theosophists call this thing fohat. It's a bridge between subject and object, between mind and matter. And it's coming from this place of no time. As Jung writes here, the unconscious has no time. There's no trouble about time in the unconscious. Part of our psyche is not in time and not in space. They are only an illusion, time and space. And so in a certain part of our psyche, time does not exist at all. So it's little wonder that people like Wheeler and co. were considering also, as part of this general project, the emergence of space and time also from this absolute, from more fundamental elements. And he has this thing called pre-geometry, which, again, if you want the technical details, go to the book with Harold. So this works both ways. We can have input information coming from the object to the subject, but it also goes the other way. And this is the whole point of participation. And it's part of physics. There's a theorem called the free will theorem by John Conway and Simon Cochrane. And they put it extremely clearly just how radical this view is. They write that Theodore Roosevelt's decision to build the Panama Canal shows that free will moves mountains, which implies by general relativity that even the curvature of space is not determined by physics. The stage is still being built while the show goes on. But this is basically the emergence of meaning, okay? There's something like that's occupying me at the moment connected to this, which is that the appearance of actuality from possibility looks fixed once a choice is made. Once we've made this decision to build the Panama Canal, for example, it looks fixed once a choice is made. But there's a whole bunch of examples, again, from John Wheeler, called delayed choice experiments, which is the idea that even the past is subject to acts of participators' interventions. We can decide also what happened in the past. We can decide whether a photon from some part of the distant universe goes through one diffraction slit, goes through one grating or another, for example. So we can choose which elements get manifested from elements of our past as well. And Wheeler even speculated at one stage that possibly we even brought the entire universe into being through our observations of the microwave background radiation from the origins of the Big Bang itself. Because we're making those manifest by our measurements that detect them, we're sort of creating our own origins. Again, we have a cycle on this view. Almost over. Schrodinger has a nice remark on this business that we seem to keep doing, especially in science, which is of pulling ourselves out. This momentous step, cutting oneself out, stepping back into the position of an observer who has nothing to do with the whole performance, has received other names, making it appear quite harmless, natural, inevitable. It might be called objectivation, looking upon the world as an object. The moment you do that, you've virtually ruled yourself out. We don't belong to this material world that science constructs for us. Well, we certainly didn't, according to the previous views. But if these sort of recent theories of physics are anything to go by, then well, we seem to be reintroducing the subject and the participator more and more into the very sort of fundamental, the fundamental structure of physics, which I think is a good thing. But if we do that, then we have to take on board the fact that we are responsible. Basically, we are responsible for the way the universe goes. And my book, Life is Short, basically is about that, about the responsibility of understanding that if there's real possibility, then you're in control, basically, of key elements of how the universe goes, which is a good thing because then you can solve things like climate crisis and whatnot. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dean. Okay, now we've got time for some questions and comments. Let's see here.
I would have one. But I can't
Harold,
wait.
we'll start with you.
I could wait, but
I'm not here yet.
yeah. Thanks, Dean. That was great as always. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a little thing and a bigger thing. The little thing is the letter to of John Wheeler to Kurt Gödel that you mentioned. I think they are talking about two different meanings of the word world. Wheeler talks about the world after the it from bit. It's my interpretation. But you know better than I, Gödel was an extremely convinced, hard-boiled Platonist in mathematics. Kurt Gödel. And it seems to me that when Kurt Gödel really talks about the world out there, he means the world of Platonic ideas. When Gödel was also in interaction with other people, when he was talking about the world, he was in many instances he was just assuming that they knew that he was the Platonist and targets this kind of preformed world of mathematical theorems that we can discover. Yeah. I mean, Gödel would really would be totally against the idea that mathematics is invented by us. He really would say, like other Platonists too, Roger Penrose, Alain Kohn, and others, that the world is the mathematical world has to be discovered. It's out there, and it's just in the form that we see it.
Yeah, I think that's probably very true. I mean, it could have quite clearly been a misunderstanding of Wheeler's on the part of Gödel. It's certainly true that Gödel viewed the mathematical world as an object that he could stroll around in like a real world. And since it's eternal, then there's every reason to think that it exists as a real thing out there. In that sense, he would be probing even more deeply into the absolute than Wheeler would be with physics, of course, as well.
Exactly. And that brings me to the other issue that I wanted to ask you actually for. Because for Gödel, every mathematical Platonist, the mathematical world is, of course, psychophysically neutral. It's neither physical nor mental, but it is not chaos at all. It's extremely structured. It has beautiful structures to be discovered. Also, for instance, for Spinoza, who would say the psychophysically neutral is just is the divine, essentially, a spiritual world. When you read the ethics, there's a huge amount of structure in there, in the divine world, right? So when you, for instance, what else could I bring up? There are maybe other examples. Yeah. For instance, for Jung, if Jung's psychophysically neutral is filled with all these archetypes. This is a realm of beautiful structures again, which are connected to one another, and so this is everything else than chaos. Now, my sense is, or my suspicion is, that Wheeler again, he looks at this world, at this maybe psychophysically neutral world, from the viewpoint of the tangible reality that he wants to create out of something that, from this viewpoint of the tangible reality, of course, must look like chaos because he does not know the structures in there. Could that be? That's my question, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was trying to find models that would make it less chaotic. So he didn't accept the chaotic nature.
Yeah.
He didn't know how to represent it, so he was looking for ways of representing it with his things like pre-geometry and so on.
But also the dragon.
And the dragon is clearly a representation of his frustration with not knowing what the hell was going on in there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
On the business of the Platonic realm being psychophysically neutral, I mean, I think it is, but it's still sort of, it has elements of manifestness about it. It has distinctions. It has distinctions. The number one is not the number two. It distinguishes itself from other numbers, and in structures you have sort of group elements that are distinguished in some way. So if you're talking about mathematical structures in that sense, then you have a whole sort of quite sophisticated level of structure, as you say, which probably is something a little bit different from maybe the notion of a really pure possibility, state of possibility.
It's not the unus mundus, that's clear. But the archetypes, but the archetypes would also be psychophysically neutral, although they can be distinguished, right?
Yeah, so it's almost like these little realms, like the archetypes and
Right.
numbers are our access point. They're sort of our closest conduit for getting there, for getting into this absolute. There's clearly something going on that's significant about how this subject object split happens. And at the talk I gave in Tucson at the consciousness conference, I also found, an example with music is another example where you're sort of a little bit lower in structure than the manifest world as it's ordinary, the conceptualized manifest world, but you're still not completely sort of in the absolute, but it's a way in, it's a way of getting closer, almost like a mystical experience or something like that.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have some questions here, starting with Farzad. He says, comment as intro to the question. Thanks for the brilliant connections. Fanes is light. So it suggests and makes sense that light is psychophysically neutral. In some ways, it crosses the boundaries between mental and physical. Wheeler's symbol uses the visual metaphor that carries the same message, seeing one's own footprints of choices made. So, question. From a physics perspective, is it necessarily always after the fact, unless you accept entanglement? If so, how is the chaos a part of quantum wholeness along with the light?
I don't think I quite got the last.
Yeah, it's.
Well, after the fact, is it,
I'll give the question again if you like.
Just the last bit. Just the last bit.
Yeah.
From the is it after the fact bit?
From a physics perspective, is it necessarily always after the fact? Then the question again, unless you accept entanglement? If so, how is the chaos a part of quantum wholeness along with the light?
So the entanglement is part of the manifest reality here. Maybe Harold's analogy confused things a little bit here. I'm not sure. So the entanglement experiments are basically just situations where we're dealing in the subject-object split, right? Where a subject, we're setting up entanglement experiments, and we do find the existence of entanglement. Wheeler acknowledges the existence of entanglement. He uses it to show you can even have entanglement that goes back in time. I'm not sure whether you were talking about, is it always after the effect? After the fact in that sense. Is it always after the fact? I think the question would need clarifying a little bit more for me.
Okay, maybe Farzad can send us some clarification, but for the, we also have one from Tamar. Dean, you alluded to Bohr's principle that observer changes the state of the observed, which is important as a criticism of objective reality. I do not believe you mentioned the quantum physics phenomena where two particles positioned in two sides of the universe are proven to be in an entangled state where their own states are in complete synchrony and changes of states occur in perfect synchrony. I'm wondering if you see any connection to Jung's theory of synchronicity.
I don't know. I thought Harold's talk dealt with that rather well. So, I mean, you certainly get these acausal correlations in these entangled states. They're actually sort of anti-correlated rather than correlated in perfect synchrony. Again, in Wheeler's terms, in Bohr's terms, what would be happening is if you make one kind of measurement, say with one polarization angle, you eliminate a whole bunch of possibilities and force the universe to go in one particular direction of evolution. And there are theorems that show that when you perform multiple of these and you get the statistics back, it shows that they can't have had their states with them sort of as essences, right, pre-existing with them. They were brought about in some sense by the experimental context that you imposed on it, which is exactly Bohr's point. That's exactly the point he was making. I don't know, maybe Harold has, this is kind of Harold's specialty, this kind of thing. So maybe he has something more to say on that particular question. I feel like it's more a question for Harold than me.
I could say something, but maybe we go for further questions before.
We do have another question from Philip Bennett. Dean, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Your comment about climate change raises the dimension of hope. If we see ourselves merely as passive observers, we miss the active power, of will and creativity to face and deal with challenges to our planet and beyond. We are in a time in between, when we have not yet realized our further human potential to impact and shape the evolving of the cosmos. I am currently intrigued by the image of Shiva as Lord of the Dance. In one hand, he holds the drum from which he begins the universe. In his other hand, he holds fire with which he destroys the universe. Perhaps it is this Shiva energy we humans are called to develop more.
Yes, exactly. The power of creation and destruction. We can do both. And we have the sort of the free will to do both. You know, we can make or not make canals. We can make decisions to do some damaging action or not do some damaging action. We have fire and creation in our hands. This is the most exciting thing about these viewpoints, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's denying this mechanical view that I mentioned at the beginning, the idea that we have no free will, we're machines, hackable machines. That's not what we want to be hearing in the present times, I don't think. I think we need the exact opposite of that. And we have positions, we have views that are completely consistent with the scientific theories that we have. You know, the way William James approached these things was, they're not really empirical questions, whether we have free will or not, whether the universe is really deterministic or not, is not quite a scientifically settleable question. So you should choose the one that makes things better. And in this case, it's clearly better to choose the idea that we have free will, so long as we understand that there's responsibilities that comes with it. But I like that question. That's very good.
Okay, Morgan.
I'll use the time for my talk to get into this a little bit more, but the question of free will, I think, is a fascinating one, a little bit different one, but, you know, and the way I read Jung has a little dimmer view of free will because of the idea of the unconscious and the question of unconscious agency. And the idea that our conscious mind may not be the agent of our actions, which completely changes the idea of free will. I mean, that's really the idea of analytic treatment, that you, as you know, St. Paul said, I do that which I would not. So there's a kind of paradoxical, when you delve in, there's a paradoxical understanding that once you submit to your incredible lack of free will at a certain point in relationship to archetypal structures, then you develop the ability to creatively reweave the threads of your existence. So I think that's so we take it out of the question of do you have it, do you not have it?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. By the way, the book, this Life is Short book, it has a whole bunch of Jungian elements, which is exactly the point you make, which is you need to make sure that it's your free will and you're not being bobbed around like a cork by a whole bunch of other forces that you think is you acting, but really it's your unconscious acting. So the process of individuation is a necessary part of sort of being fully responsible with your acts of will and making sure they are acts of will and not, you know, the appearance of acts of will.
Right. It turns out we are hackable machines until we're not.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, can I emphasize real quick what you both said actually, because it has, of course, a big impact on almost all of the studies of so-called free will that are done in cognitive neuroscience. This what they discuss is a faint shadow of what actually is really going on, as Morgan said. And I think a wonderful text that I can recommend to read about this, of course, Jung is wonderful already, but a wonderful text is Schelling's Freedom Essay of 1809, believe it or not. Highly recommended.
Well, and I don't know if this is related, but I'm sure you are all aware that some of the latest neuropsych research shows that people become aware of the idea that they would like to do something often after their motor neurons have fired, which means that the idea of free will might be about assigning responsibility to an action that's actually the agency of which is somewhere else, in ourselves as a whole. But anyway, that's a very fascinating question to me.
I agree, yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here, I think, as we wrap up. First of all, Farzad responds, yes, classical physics assumes all observations are after the fact. Objects are in the past. By quantum wholeness, observations are not necessarily in the past. For example, precognitive synchronicities. So perhaps chaos and light relations. I think we'll let that one lie for the moment. Let's leave a comment, Dean. And next we have Sylvester Watkowski. The absolute or non-being possibilities Jung talks about in the Black Books and the Red Book as pleroma, the Gnostic notion of original undifferentiated realm. It divides into efficacy and non-efficacy. Efficacy is abraxas, that is, whatever can be actualized. In the cosmology, the abraxas can be influenced by man. So here he conceives of the impact of man on what can be manifest. Mm-hmm. How can you account for historical ideas that spoke about these phenomena prior to the questions that we formulated to understand this process with complex apparatus to look at the answers? It seems to me that humans from early on could speak about these processes poetically.
Yeah, that's another good example. I had in my comments somewhere a comment about the pleroma, actually. There's lots of examples you can find where the same thing seems to be said. You can either, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a puzzle. Obviously, there's a lineage of thought that's come from these Gnostic ideas to the present day. And these are very smart people. Jung was absolutely immersed in all of this material himself, the alchemists and so on, who were drawing back from the Egyptian ideas and the Babylonian ideas and the Gnostic ideas. So there's lineage that can take you from one to the other. Not so sure about Wheeler. Eddington had spiritual sides. Bohm was certainly immersed in all of this history. He really knew his history about these things. So they were talking about the same things. They were suddenly putting it differently, but the reason why it looks similar today is because they are genuinely drawing from the same set of ideas, I think. Because there's probably some deep truth to them.
That's what we hope.
Yes. Okay, well, with that, we're going to break for lunch here in New York and perhaps a midnight snack. Dean, thank you very much.
I think it's more of a 2:17 a.m. night snack.
Okay. Not to quibble. So then we'll break until, well, it's noon in New York, and we will break until 2 p.m. New York time.
Steve, thanks for a great talk.